it's not the kind of book that most people would read from cover to cover, but I glanced at all 644 pages and studied many in depth. In addition to discovering places that I never knew existed, I've gotten answers to questions that I've wondered about for a long time, such as the origin of names like the Quiet Side and Breakneck Road, RA Corner, and Wonderland. And thanks to Henry, I now know why there's a Brown Mountain Gatehouse, but no Brown Mountain. To me, one of the most impressive things about your book, Henry, are the last 36 pages, which I estimate to contain about 1,000 references of sources of information. And one of those sources is the Southwest Harbor Public Library Digital Archive, for which I'm the interim curator. And I recently added a few new items to the archive based on what I learned in Henry's book. And so it goes, this library helped Henry write his book, and the book helped the library improve our collection. So thank you, Henry. Henry has produced what I think will be the definitive source of MDI place name information for generations to come. And it joins the ranks of books like Nell Thornton's Traditions and Records of Southwest Harbor and Soamesville, and Rita Kenway's Scott's Island, Maine, Its People, 1880 to 1992. Clearly, Henry's book was a labor of love. It's a precious gift to all of us who love Mount Desert Island. Again, thank you, Henry. Please welcome the author of Place Names of Mount Desert Island and the Cranberry Islands, Maine, Henry Raup.
Thank you very much. It was very kind of you. Thank you. Much of which I have to say tonight, you're already familiar with. So my apologies if I'm just telling you what you already know, but maybe it'll put it in context.
You don't watch it on TV.
I don't know how to watch it on TV.
No.
The book, as most of you probably are aware, was published this summer by the MDI Historical Society. I'm indebted to the society.
Yeah, I'm gonna get one. Let me get one.
They might not want to publish it pretty much as I produced it. I thought they might want to make a lot of changes. They made virtually no changes, except the young lady who helped edit it that the Historic Society provided. She made many useful changes, mostly fine tuning, spelling corrections and that sort of thing. So really it's a product that we owe the Historic Society a great debt of gratitude for producing it. Oh, and I should mention in the Historic Society it was Tim Garrity and Randy Bench that really made it possible. Tim Garrity took an interest on it early after his arrival on the island, and I was in frequent contact with him over various names. And when he retired, Randy pretty much took over the interest that Tim had. So we owe him a lot for publishing the book and doing it pretty much as I had envisioned from the beginning. A little background before we get into the details. Background on my own interest. I've long been interested in place names, but it's a matter of heredity, I think. My father was the leading place names authority for the state of Ohio, and it worked both for the state government and for the federal government on various place names. So I rather grew up with place names. Watching Dad work on the Ohio place names, I was very familiar with what he was doing. And much of the procedure that I used for this book, I simply copied from him. So my apologies for just copying it. I first visited the island in the 1950s, before I had any particular interest in names. Came here on a regular basis, I guess every summer since 1979. Worked for the park for 13 summers, starting in 1979. So I've had this long interest in MDI and the surrounding territory. It wasn't until about 1982 I got serious about gathering place names. But from 82 to the time this was published, that's about all I did. No golf. Well, that's not true. I'd go off hiking and such, but no golf or tennis or any of those. It was work on this book, and you'll see the product now. So what is the result of all of this effort? There have been identified in the book about 1,400 distinctive names. Those are the so-called target names, the primary name that's applied to a site. Of the 1,400, a high percentage have secondary names or variants as they're known. And I think about 1,200 names involve the variants. There are also about 800 names that I've cataloged but can't locate for one reason or another. They haven't been identifiable by location. Many of these were in 19th century newspaper references. They may have been familiar to people then, but I can't find them now. So there's a sizable supplement of names I've identified, but I can't tell where they are. And they've been excluded from the book since we can't locate them specifically. So about 1,400 total names, about 1,200 variants, about 800 that we can't locate specifically. Almost all of these names evolved through the years. Some of them of very early duration or established very early, and we're still getting new names added at the present time. And we'll get into a bit of this a bit later on, I think. There is a considerable variety of names on this island. The island's, I think, about 105 square miles. If we add the Cranberries, Bartlett Island, maybe the Porcupines, all of which are included in this book, we probably go to 110 or 15 square miles. 15 or 1,400 names in this collection of what is that? I don't know. We might get a dozen names per square mile, and that's a very high name density. You don't find very many places, I think, in the country that have that many names in such a confined area. So we get easily a dozen names per square mile for the entire island. That's if we average over the entire area, of course. Why do we have this collection of 1,400 plus names? Part of it is due to the diversity on the island. Let's say at an extreme contrast, take a square mile of central Illinois. No mountains there, no coastline, no seashore. Here in the same square mile, we have all of those. Here we have a mountain in a single square mile, maybe a mountain, a beach, a couple of coves, an island or two, just numerous names in a relatively small and concentrated area. So that's one of the distinctive elements, I think, of the place names on this island. Just the diverse environment that we have here contributes to the large number of place names that we have. Then, in addition, we have to add a second element, and this is the historical development of the island. Many places had just a handful of settlers, let us say, and things pretty much stabilized after that point. Go up to central Maine or northern Maine, and you find a little variety in the historic background. But here, as we'll get into in just a minute, tremendous number of individuals who came here, many of whom gave us the place names, and certainly they didn't give us the names directly. They contributed to the place name variety that we have on the island. These, of course, started as early as the French exploration along the coast, and they continue to the present time with the establishment of a new housing development. Well, let's say at Ripples Hill off of Beach Hill Road. So the place names have been being applied to the island for a long time, almost well before the island was settled. Now, how did I handle the place names? What was the procedure for gathering and recording the names? Basically, I looked at whatever source I could find. Maps, particularly historic maps, of course, guidebooks, newspapers. I spent hours going through the microfilm reels of island newspapers. Just any number of sources of names that could be dredged up. There is a distinction between printed place names and oral place names. Unfortunately, oral usage was very hard to acquire. I could interview people and did interview a number of people, not enough, but some, about their use of place names, particularly old timers around, the fishermen, for example. That was very useful, but very slow and time consuming. Also biased because I could ask a fisherman, let's say, where he went fishing, and he'd give me a half a dozen names, but then forgot to mention the other ones that he had visited on some other trip. So the establishment of oral usage was very iffy, and it would be nice if it had been accomplished more uniformly, but it wasn't possible. That means virtually everything in the book comes from printed sources, wherever I could find them. Very heavily, of course, those documents and such, but where I could find, let's say, a source that hadn't appeared in print, in the town records, for example, I'd go there and go through the records as much as I could. So the source of names came from wherever I could find them. I had interviews with a few. It would have been useful to have many more interviews than I did, but very time consuming. Many people who were familiar with names and I would like to have interviewed didn't really feel comfortable spilling the beans. They didn't want to talk to me particularly. Others did, and those were very useful when they did. But there were biased accumulations of names, only what happened to come up during an interview, for example, not the long list of names they might have had. I had one interview, some of you may remember Joe Trafton from here at Southwest Harbor. Had a long interview with Joe at his house one day. He had a friend come in and they sat across the room from me and for a couple of hours bounced reminiscences of the island back and forth. And all I had to do was sit there and listen and write down and record what they were saying. That was very useful because they generated the names. I didn't have to say, well, what do you call such and such? And that always creates a certain bias in the use of names. But if they start talking names back and forth in idle conversation, then it probably means that it was a useful name. So my interviews with such people as Joe Trafton, Wendell Seavey with Bass Harbor, and others, very useful, but unfortunately not enough of them. It would have been good to have many more such interviews. So what did I do with these names? If I dredged them off a map, out of guidebooks, off of government documents, the interviews and so forth, how did I handle them? What did I do with them? Here I dredged a bit of my prior history with names. Back in, well, as far back as World War II, my father worked for the principal place name agency with the federal government, the U.S. Board on Geographic Names. So I was familiar with names through his work there. And so one summer internship I spent in Washington at the BGN, Board on Geographic Names, working on place names there. I, in effect, was exposed to the BGN approach to names. And so that's really what I adopted. So I think we can start. Can we have the first slide or picture? No, not that one. The one before that one. That's it. Can you enlarge that any?
Yeah, if you can get that bigger.
When this project first started, it was essentially pre-computer. Everything was done by hand. And that was true at the federal level as well. So this, okay, that's better. This is a sample of the card that the BGN, Board on Geographic Names, used to record place names. Not just here, of course, but everywhere in the country. And these are my own cards and entries, incidentally, but it was their card that I adopted. The BGN had thousands of names, millions maybe for the whole country. For this island, you can imagine, well, I've come up with the 1,400 names plus the supplements. So I've got 1,400 of these cards in a file. And you can imagine I would come to the library, locate a map, want to record a name that the map used, and I'd have to go through and shuffle through 1,000 of these cards to find the right one, and then enter the information that was appropriate. You can imagine very slow and time consuming. BGN hung onto these cards well after I had given them up, which I suppose tells you something about the federal government. They just keep going in what they'd had previously. Well, I soon learned this was not the way to go. And as we entered the computer era, I was a little slow in doing this, but I finally got into the computer era and converted the entire, 1,400 cards from this onto the computer. And that was rather time consuming because I had to enter everything by hand. It was all, every line had to be entered in the computer separately. So got into the computer era in, what was this? I don't remember, maybe the late 1980s. And now we can go to the next slide. Okay, and we can enlarge that if possible. And on the computer, I no longer had to shuffle through 1,000 cards if I wanted to enter one name or one use of a name. I just had to pull up the card and there it was, and I would enter the name on the card. This is just, well, this is for Cadillac Mountain. One of, I can't read it, is it one of 8 cards? Oh no, that's yours. I think this is just one of 8 cards that applied to Cadillac or to, yes, Cadillac Mountain. And you will see, well, you may not be able to read it, but coming down the list are every use of the name that I could locate that had been applied to Cadillac. And here, as this was the first card in the series, it deals with quite a few names that we've long since forgotten. I think, well, there's Troll Mountain, yes, Troll Mountain there. Well, that was 1986. But each of the names that I encountered, wherever I could find it, I would enter on these cards or subsequently onto the computer database. You see towards the bottom, or you may be able to see, the mountain was once known, so this was Champlain. No, I can't read it from here.
Cadillac,
What does it say at the very top?
Cadillac,
Cadillac, okay, well then what was, I've forgotten this. You see how much I forgot. It was called Mount Newport for a short time. Usually Newport is applied to Champlain Mountain, but for a short time it was also applied to Cadillac. So every use of a name applied to Cadillac Mountain, I record first on the cards and then later on the database. Incidentally, if you ever have any questions, feel free to ask them. I don't mind being interrupted if something
On
springs
that
to
one,
it.
your subtitle was Summit.
Sorry, yes. In dealing with place names, the specific type of feature had to be identified so that, well, consider flowing water, might be a stream, a brook, a creek, a rill, and probably a dozen other names. And BGN says, let's put these all into one category. They'll all be listed as stream, not rill or brook. So they're all stream. Well, when we deal with the mountains, there are different ways of looking at the mountain. And BGN has said, let's apply the word summit to every mountain that I suppose has a summit, although probably some ridges they would identify as summits as well. So every such feature that might fall under the mountain or hill, or what else, any one of these various terms for the physical feature would all be listed here just as summit. That means in searching through the database, I could run a search. I didn't have to look separately for rill and brook and creek. I just searched stream and every stream would come up. Well, the same thing here, every summit would come up. And that would include not just Cadillac, a summit, but it would include, well, any of the mountains on this side, Beach Mountain. It would include even relatively small summits, the triads on the east side would be listed as a summit. So every type of feature has been reduced to one of these probably 40 or 50 different categories: summit, stream, cove. No, I'm sorry. Yes, the coves, bays would be larger than the coves. So this was simply to enable me to pull out all of the summits if I was doing a search for those. Well, that's how the names have been recorded on the BGN cards or later onto the computer in forms such as this. Now, how did these many names, I think you can take this off, by the way, I'm done with it, I think. How did these many names come to be established? Why do we have 1,400 different names, 1,400 plus their variants? This is largely a result of the historic evolution of names on the island. And we can identify clearly 4 main periods in which the names were established. I say main periods because we could subdivide some of them into sub-periods, and in a way I'll do that in just a minute. But 4 main periods in which we can find names coming into use, being established. The first of these, the period of exploration, early exploration of the island. Oh, let me back up before I get there. My periods start with European exploration here. And that's the first one I want to talk about. But I should mention prehistoric native use on the island. This has been a real problem for me because none of the original native names survive in use on the island. And as far as I know, none survive amongst the present tribes. When I've dealt with the Indian use on the island, and I've done a couple of interviews on that, they give me a modern name for a name for some feature that we have today. Just for example, when I asked about native names on the island, they came up with a name, which I don't remember offhand, but it was the name for Cerdamont Spring. Well, at the time of native occupants on the island, Cerdamont Spring was not what it is today. And I really doubt that the natives had a distinctive name for that one, maybe inconsequential spring, when there were springs all over the island. So I really have problems in identifying native use on the island and question virtually all of the current native recognition of island names. Well, that means in effect, then, as far as I can tell, we're beginning our naming process with European exploration of the island. The first explorers really gave us a number of names, but the names had no residual use, no use on the island itself. The reason, of course, is that the explorers were offshore. There was no permanent settlement of the island. So you could ask the local people, well, what's the name of this island? Consequently, during this period of exploration, the island names that we have that survive today were largely imposed from outside and by sometimes people who really didn't know what they were dealing with. So the name of the island itself, Mount Desert Island, is a corruption of the French version, which was simply a name imposed by Champlain as he came by the island. That means these names were used by outsiders, but not by natives. There were no natives except possibly the Indians who were here. So the Cranberry Islands were named during this period. Southwest Harbor was named at this period. Even before there was a settlement at Southwest Harbor came into use as a harbor, and then very quickly it was applied to the settlement here on the early side. During this period then, the period of exploration, only a half a dozen names that we still use today came into use. Other names that might have developed at the time have maybe been forgotten. There is a problem in dealing with the French use of names on this island because a number of names that appear to be French names are not really. The origin, the may be derived from some French use, but the French never called Acadia Mountain, nor did these early explorers refer to a number of other similar names that we now attribute to a French origin. Saint-Sevier Mountain was not a name applied by the French. That was applied later on. So the French left only a handful of names and not very well established. And I think, unlike other sections along the Maine coast, I think none of the original French version of these names survives today. A second period of naming on the island came during the period of early settlers. Roughly from say 1750 to 1850, roughly a century, although that's a little more than is fair, but roughly a century of the early settlers. These individuals settled along the coast, hence the names they applied were related primarily to coves and inlets, peninsulas, bays, rarely to the interior of the island, rarely to the mountains themselves. A few mountains might be named, especially particularly prominent, as Cadillac Mountain was named early. But most of the hills and mountains early on were unnamed. There was no real reason to name these because everybody lived along the coast. Their economy was a maritime economy, and they were looking seaward rather than landward. So most of the early settlers' names were along the coast. And to this end, we got such names locally as Clark Point, Fernald Point, Kings Point. Every one of these, the site of somebody's house. And that, in establishing name usage, by the way, helped a lot because we can go back to the old records and look to see where the Fernalds lived. And it made sense to see they lived on Fernald Point. This period up until 1850 or so was not a period of fancy names. The names were all very basic, very direct. Where are we going to go fishing today and where are we going to plow tomorrow? But no commemorative names. We didn't find names that were purely romantic names, let's say. It was always a basic name, a landowner, for example, or sometimes where a particular event took place, which occasionally happened. A third period in the development of island names, and maybe the most important of the four names, was the 19th century, which we can relate to the tourists, the rusticators, often people from outside coming here. And they were interested in much more than just the coast. They were interested in hiking on the island mountains, exploring the valleys, and every one of these had to be named. And consequently, a high percentage of the names, possibly half of all of the names, maybe more, came during this period in which we had the rusticators, the cottagers, the hikers and
Artists,
explorers, the who's?
artists,
Mhm.
artists.
Oh, the artists. Yes, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned this. During this period, artists contributed their names: Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, O'Lane, and others. They did the paintings on the island. Some paintings, they seem to have created a name. Others, they adopted an existing name. So Eagle Lake, for example, came in a very early painting, for example. It's hard sometimes to tell who created the name when an artist put it on a painting or a sketch. Some of them, it seems very clear it was a name that was already in use, and certainly the artists created their own names for others. There are other sort of specialty users. Their surveyors came up with their names. Property all had to be surveyed, and this included some of the earliest occupants on the island. And I spent a good deal of time going through the old deeds. Gold mine for digging out old names, but very slow going. Just for example, the survey between the towns of Bar Harbor and Mount Desert, from Great Head to head of Somes Sound to the head of Otter Cove. And all along this line, the surveyors would name where they had put a survey marker. And that helped a lot going through these old records. And it's a wonder that so many of these records survive, but they've been a boon to us. In 1872, a government surveyor arrived, and he introduced possibly more names than any other single individual, at least as far as I can tell. And so a lot of the names we now use, and many others we've forgotten, came from the 1872 map. That map established the use of Turtle Lake on Bubble Pond, for example. We have these early maps, the early explorers and the early maps that provide us with a lot of useful information on the origin of names. There was also
We have a question from
Yes.
one of the online participants.
Okay.
Can you give us an example of French names that are no longer in use?
You say French names that are no longer in use? I think what I was implying is the French names that were applied have been anglicized. So not very many of them, but those that were applied in French have all been anglicized now. The name of the island, for example.
Thank you.
On that point, do you have any opinions on the Mount Desert? Is it desert versus Mount Desert?
This is a chronic question.
Big
I
question.
should have anticipated it. In fact, if you go back, you maybe remember Samuel Eliot Morrison's small book.
Yeah.
There's a footnote there that discusses this and says there are two schools of thought. The ice cream and cake school of thought that says Mount Desert is correct, and the arid land school that says Mount Desert is correct. I am not competent to tell you which is correct, and I'm not sure there is a correct. It may be whatever you grew up with, In fact, that probably is true. What you're accustomed to, maybe what you feel comfortable with. I have been criticized, in fact, roundly criticized for using the wrong version anyway, he ran a boatyard at the head of Somme Sound, now deceased, but anyway,
Butler,
thank you. Butler. what's his-
Mr. Butler, I can't remember. his
I've forgotten his, anyway,
Farnham. Farnham.
Oh, Farnham, yes, that's it.
well, he really ripped into me for misusing Mount Desert and Mount Desert. I think now it's probably what you grew up with, and I've tended to bounce back and forth. I'm not really sure what should be used. Some years ago, I spent a lot of time listening to the park and the local radio scanner, and was interested when the Mount Desert or Mount Desert police department would refer to Mount Desert and Mount Desert, Mount Desert and Mount Desert in the same sentence. So I think there's just no agreement on what is correct. In fact, I didn't mention it, and maybe I should add a footnote. For most names, there is no correct name. It's whatever most of us accept and what has come into common use. And I will often say a correct name, but who's to say what is correct? It's just whatever has evolved through the years. I see I'm running too long. I was worried I wouldn't have enough. A few foreign names and more picturesque names came into use. Let's say during this third period that I was mentioning, Cathedral Rock near Bar Harbor came into use at this time, and Via Mala, the whole through Cathedral Rock, came into use at this time. So every part of the island has experienced its acquisition of names. Well, during this period up until, well, let's say 1850 to 1950, we got such names as Flying Mountain, as far as I know, came into use during that period. Ocean House Hill, that Nance at the site of the Ocean House Hotel, came into use during this period. So a number of names evolved here. The fourth period, and the last of the four main periods, came during the 20th century. These, I suppose we can sort of lump together as modern names. New housing developments came in, new trails were added to the mountains. Each one of these had to have a name applied to it or develop an association with it. So during this more modern era, we see names such as Head of the Harbor coming in here at Southwest Harbor. Not a name that I've ever documented prior to the 20th century. Some names, Norwood Cove is a 20th century name, never used, Norwood Square, never used prior to the 20th century. So some of the names are distinctly modern 20th century names. An interesting collection of names have been added by the police departments. Every accident has to be recorded. Where did the accident happen? So every patrolman out there has come up with his own name that may or may not become established. For many years, everybody knew where Blunder Hill was at the head of Somme Sound. Now, most people don't know where Blunder Hill is. The newspaper reporter who, or maybe the police officer who used Blunder Hill has left the island, presumably. And so nobody uses Blunder Hill anymore except myself. I do. And this has happened with many of the names, of course.
And Henry, where is Blunder Hill?
Oh, sorry. If I can describe it, just south of RA Corner, which in itself is an interesting name. Just south of RA Corner, there's a steep slope dropping down to a stream, and that steep slope is Blunder Hill. It's most notable traveling north from Northeast Harbor. You come down into that valley and then a bend to the right and then up Blunder Hill. So it's just south of RA Corner. And I mentioned RA Corner. The very first interview I held with a local person says smugly, bet you don't know where RA Corner is. And no, I didn't for the first interview. The second interview I had, bet you don't know where RA Corner is. Yes, I do, because the last interview told me where. So I bet I've had a dozen people tell me that you don't know where RA Corner is, but we all do, and even the newspaper uses RA Corner. And you all know RA Corner?
No.
Nobody-
No.
I don't have
No,
to-
that's where everybody parks in the car when they want to meet somebody.
I don't have to tell you where RA Corner is then.
Well, let's see. So it's at the intersection of Eagle Lake Road, 233 and Route 3,
It's right across the street, this little park.
and it's Raggedy Blank Corner.
Yes. Ragged ass corner, raggedy ass corner, which everybody would say that you don't know where it is. And just, it was one of the very first names to pop up in the interviews. I've run out of time, so we're going to end this. Before we get into the park development of names, George Dorr, just to show you what could happen, came up with quite a few names on the island, changed many of the names as well. Some of Dorr's name changes were adopted, are now in current use. A few of his names were not adopted and never accepted. He wanted to rename one mountain Holt Mountain for a friend of his. It was never accepted. On the other hand, his change from Astahu Hill to Elliott Mountain at Northeast Harbor was easily adopted. And incidentally, George Dorr, without changing the elevation of the mountain, changed it from a hill to a mountain, from Astahu Hill to Elliott Mountain. Well, George Dorr, just to short circuit it, did have an effect on place names, some of which we use today. In fact, a fair number, at least a dozen of Dorr's name changes are in common use today. The change from Robinson Mountain to Acadia Mountain, from Dog Mountain to Sansevier Mountain. These were all George Dorr names changes. Well, with that, I'll open it to questions if you have any, or I'll stick around and answer questions for those who have them.
I've got a few from online. We've got one that says, what's the origin of Algerine Coast in Seal Cove?
We do not know exactly. I recommend a book that you read that mentions this. There have been suggestions it was the name of a ship that was wrecked along the shore. Other suggestions of a link to the Algerian coast. We don't know exactly, yeah. And I should add, a high percentage of the island names, we don't know how they got started. We see they cropped up on a map in the 19th century. How it got there, we don't know.
You said there was a book that we should read?
Oh, yeah, yes, it happens to have been recently published. I can highly recommend it.
Okay. Excellent. What is your version of the origin of the name RA Corner?
I think, no, I didn't discuss the origin of the name. I only have a suspicion. In fact, that may be all anybody has. I have been told, and that's the way I got most of this information, that the newspaper would not use ragged ass. And so the newspaper started saying RA Corner. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it makes sense to me.
But why RA Corner?
Oh, I'm sorry. There are two, or maybe more than two. Read a book. There are at least two that I remember. One is that before the intersection was regraded, there was a steep slope coming down as you headed west. And people would come down this slope and slide through the intersection. The other explanation that I remember is that I think the Norwood family lived, I think still lives there, or recently lived there, in the house right just north of RA Corner. And the legend is the Norwood kids ran around inadequately clothed. And I'll leave the rest to you.
Thank you. Was Frenchman Bay simply named after Champlain or the Frenchmen who would hide on their ships waiting for British sailors? The origin of Frenchman's Bay.
I was not named by Champlain. It predates Champlain, as I recall. And it was, when I hear somebody saying yes, and so contribute what you know. But it predates Champlain and is one of the earlier names. As I recall, even pre-English, the French fleets would anchor north of the Porcupine chain, and hence it became Frenchman's Bay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, any other? Yes.
Maybe a comment first and then a question. My wife, Susie is her name, bought this the summer from the Historical Society, and she has totally enjoyed reading it and looking up names. So if she were here, she would, I'm sure, recommend it to anybody here who might be interested.
Glad to hear that.
And her only question was, we live on Herrick Road here, right here in Southwest Harbor, and she was not sure about the origin of the name of that road. Presumably it was from a Herrick family, and it was developed in the 50s, we understand.
Okay, now, first, a footnote. I have not dealt with the origin of road names.
Okay.
When I started this project, that is still on the list of items to cover in volume 2. Do you think volume 2 will ever be done? No. So I can't really tell you much about the great road name, but it illustrates a need for somebody to investigate it. And in this case, I don't think I can help you at all with the origin of that name. It just doesn't ring a bell. Sorry about that.
Got one more here. Do you have a sense of whether any names we use now are doomed to be forgotten? For example, Baldwin Corners.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure many of the names will be lost. Those most likely to be lost have already started on their way. As people move away or a new property owner comes on, an earlier name disappears. One that will be interesting to watch is the use of the tarn. The tarn, you may realize, was an artificial lake added by George Dorr. It was just a wet meadow before Dorr went to work on it. The park has said we're not going to continue maintaining the tar as Dorr wanted it to do. So if you look at the tarn now, it's a pretty well filled in, maybe almost completely filled in now. Actually, it's been a couple of years since I've been by the tarn. But my guess is in another, 25, 30 years, the tarn will be a wet meadow and just a thing forgotten. And this is happening for a number of names, I think. Some sites are destroyed as a new road is built, and so it disappears. So yes, some will go. Any other question? Well, I thank you very much for coming, and sorry I talked so long and didn't give you enough time to ask questions, but I'll stick around and answer questions if you have, or you can email me if you wish to do that. So I'll be happy to help. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So if people have new information to share with you, do you want it? Or are you like, I'm done?
I am still adding any information I acquire, I still accumulate it. It won't get into print, however. If things really went nicely, a supplement would come out in a year or two, but I really doubt that's going to happen. But I do just take whatever change. If somebody sees an error in this book, I put it on the computer. And if I get a new name or a lead to one, I add that to the computer, all of which might be an interesting supplement, but whether that'll happen or not, I don't know.
I have a question about the name Ike's Point. Now, my understanding was it was actually named after Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes.
I've never heard that.
Ickes Point.
I've
Spelled
never
the
heard
same
that.
way.
In fact, if I had heard that before, I would start writing this down. And I will tonight when I get home. But no, I think is, I've never heard it, and I'm sure it's a
No, I read it somewhere.
okay.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, Ike Stanley was a local individual, and he had lobster pounds at a couple places, Wonderland,
Yeah.
Wonderland, Seawall, and at Ike's Point.
Oh, okay.
So that's his first name.
So that was Isaac Stanley, and he went by Ike.
I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think Herrick came up too. That was a family name too. I don't know whether that's why Herrick.
Which was that?
Herrick for Herrick Road. There was a Herrick family
Yeah, but
a long time ago.
They had some
there is no
Cemetery,
Harris
in the
feature in the
cemetery.
book.
It's
Sorry.
Herrick.
Well, the Herrick family.
Herrick Road,
Mhm. Oh, Herrick, I'm
HERRECK.
sorry, I
That's
heard
okay.
Harris.
Yep.
Yeah, there probably is a Herrick down in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember offhand.
There was a question if the bubbles were a cleaned up version of Door's Bubbies. I don't know.
It goes before Door.
Okay.
It goes back to, if I remember correctly, you can read about it in the book. If I remember, it goes back to the early fishermen who loved to use them as a reference point for marking position offshore. And it was the boobies, which, I don't know just when the boobies went out of fashion, but certainly it would have been the park and probably, and maybe pre-park. Didn't think that was appropriate, so it became gradually the bubbles. Interestingly, Bubble Mountain was named for the bubbles, but Pematic Mountain is in between. That's always baffled me. But these things happen.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'll be happy to stick around.